finished by the time I'm supposed to be finished, okay? But if it gets to be, time is now 1:30, it gets to be 2:15 and I ain't done talking, y'all throw something at me and I'll know that it's time for me to shut up and let's move on, okay? But I think I can cover about 35, 40 minutes, give everybody time to go down and get some coffee. Hope y'all had a good lunch. Hope everybody is sufficiently caffeinated and now we'll have a good. Y'all, I have done this jacket as long as I can. Y'all forgive me. I hope you don't think me overly informal here, but it is warm in here. Okay, I've got a little timer set, but that doesn't mean I'm more like noticing, you know. When I was in the 2nd grade, y'all, something really weird happened to me. Okay, I was sitting in our little trailer in Jumpertown where we had our 1st and 2nd grade classes, you know, and Miss Anne-Marie Ford was my teacher. Miss Ford was just this wonderful, sweet lady, very patient with a bunch of 2nd graders. But she wasn't too patient this particular day, okay? But we were doing, I believe it was a writing assignment, okay? And we had our little, y'all, I don't think anybody here is as old as I am. Back in those days, we had a little tablet. We had a little tablet, you know, and we had the little lines, the little dotted line between it. I think we were actually learning how to write cursive letters. Y'all remember the Z trying to make that little tangle? Okay, I think that's what we're working on. And we had those big 30-gauge pencils that they gave us back in the, I don't know why we had these huge pencils back in that. Like the smaller the hand, the bigger the pencil. I don't know what the logic was there. But anyway, we're just writing away, you know, and she was just teaching away. And all of a sudden she said, "Who is doing that?" Like that. Miss Ford is angry. What have we done? There had been a heck of a racket up until then. It turns out what had happened was someone had, get this, see, some of you will, Tiffany, you may have your mind blown by this. Someone was flipping the lid of their cigar box. In those days, we carried our supplies in cigar boxes. I am not making that up, okay? I mean, you'd be hauled off to prison now if you started at school. But I had mine as a Swisher Sweets. We'd smoke them on the way to school. It was a different time, as they say. So, but someone, we had them under our seats. We had those wooden seats, and someone was flicking the lid of their cigar box up against the bottom of that seat, bom, bom, like that. And I was surprised to learn that someone was doing this, okay? I was even more surprised to learn how it was that I knew that that's what they were doing. And I slowly moved my hand away from the cigar box lid. I had no idea I was doing it, y'all. So, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Charlie Smart, I work in adult ed. For those of you who do know me, I'm well aware of the irony of me being up here talking about attention, okay? I am an unlikely ambassador, to say the very least. And as I think we've established, it does not come natural to me, okay? But I have learned a lot over the years, and I have researched this greatly in learning how to help students learn more effectively, okay? And so hopefully some of the things that I have learned will be helpful to you and that you can share with your students, and I hope it's helpful. So, I'm also well aware, by the way, that you are perfectly capable of keeping your students' attention. I'm not suggesting otherwise, okay? What I am suggesting is that, number one, we can't be with them all the time. I mean, we're not responsible for them 100%, but if our goal as educators is to give people the skills they need to succeed, then that's a good one to teach them, right? Or to help them to get better at. I'm also aware, number two, that even when we are with them, sometimes it can still be a little bit of a challenge, right? I mean, I was asking about Zoom instruction. Y'all remember the pandemic and the lockdown, and this student on your screen, okay? We check those things every 12 minutes on average, by the way. And We are simply facing challenges. I'm going to skip this over just a little bit. We're simply facing challenges we have not faced before, y'all, both as educators and as students and as just people in general. I mean, I would never say that this is the most difficult time in history, okay? I will, however, say it is the most distracting time in history. I think we can say that. I mean, we have this barrage of information coming at us from you can't turn on a ball game, okay? I was watching the ball game, watching my beloved Mississippi State Bulldogs go down in flames. And I was just like counting the things that are on the screen besides the ball game. Now, when I was a kid, watching the wide world of sports or a ball game on TV, you turn on the TV, the ball game was on. That's all that was on there, okay? You might have, in basketball, when they got the shot clock, they might have a little snippet up there of the shot clock, it was on top of the backboard, and then whenever somebody would shoot, it would rattle in the frame. But now, I mean, you've got all this stuff on there, and everything is distracting. And the analogy that I've heard used is drinking from a fire hose, like us consuming information now. That sounds about right, doesn't it? It's just this overwhelming amount of information, and it's hard to navigate. It's hard to navigate. And tech makes it even worse. Now look, technology has brought us an awful lot of good in our lives, and social media does an awful lot of good. It can. News feeds, we want to know what's going on, But it's like I tell my students and I tell my children, okay? Social media especially is like a knife. You can use it to cut up vegetables and feed yourself something nutritious, or you can use it to stab somebody or stab yourself. And a cursory scroll through the media site of your choice will usually give you good examples of all three, right? It's all in how you use it. But look, the attention economy is in fact a thing, and attention engineering is a thing. Google that sometime. That's if you feel like you need a bit of dystopia, that might fit the bill. Look that up and see how attention engineering works, okay? And your attention is in fact a commodity, and so is mine, and so is everyone's. Now, I'm not saying that this is a horrible thing. What I am saying is that what we find ourselves in now is a specific time in a specific environment that requires a specific mode of operation. Up until now, we've had this sort of hunt and peck approach to, figuring out how to work with this. I don't think that's going to do it, okay? We've got to have a way of working with our attention, and so do our students. And as difficult as attention is these days, it is absolutely critical to thinking and to learning especially, okay? It's the first step to any cognitive endeavor. I mean, it's just how do I have that written? You can only do something about what you are aware of, okay? If you're not aware of it, you can't do anything about it. And so we've got to be able to focus on certain things, like I say, to do anything about them. William James, the godfather of American psychology, basically in America. He brought psychology to America, wrote the Principles of Psychology in 1890, a widely quoted source. And he said it like this. He said, I'll back up so y'all can see this. The faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again is the very root of judgment, character, and will. And then he went on to say that, nobody can be master of themselves, compos sui, if you can't do that. And he said an education that helped people to do that would be the education par excellence. And then, and I love this final part, he said, but it is easier to define this ideal than to give practical directions for helping to bring it about. In other words, attention is very, 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 very important, but it's easier said than done. Thanks, Godfather of American Psychology. It's very helpful, right? So we know it's important, but he said we don't know how to do it. We've learned a few things since 1890. Also, it is absolutely essential to learning because it allows our brains to change in the way that our brains need to change in order to learn. Okay, as y'all probably know, learning involves a process called neuroplasticity, where the brain literally changes. You know, it creates different pathways within the brain and solidifies those pathways. And in order for that to happen, the brain has to release certain chemicals within itself, certain neuromodulators and neurotransmitters that allow those changes to take place. And we can only do that, especially after we're age 25, roughly 25, when our brains are fully formed, our prefrontal cortex is fully formed. Up until then, we can do it a little easier. Little kids especially just soak everything up. But as we get on into our teenage years and older, we really have to focus on what we're trying to learn if it's going to get in there at all. Okay, and I'm going to show you a visual model of this in just a little bit to illustrate what I'm talking about. So it's the first step to learning. It doesn't occur otherwise. And if y'all been in a classroom for more than 10 minutes with students, y'all know that. Okay, I know. And so, how do we get better at it? And how do we help students to get better at it? Well, I think it helps to begin by understanding what it is as best we can and understanding how it works. Now, there have been a lot of definitions, all right? Attention is a concept in psychology, and like any concept in psychology, it's been defined to death, okay? I've heard it said before that a psychologist would rather eat another psychologist's hat than to use his or her terms and definitions, okay? But one that holds up pretty well is from none other than the Godfather himself, our friend William James, who said, y'all, this is my favorite definition ever, because he begins this definition of attention by saying, everybody knows what attention is. Like, why are you asking me? Everybody knows what it is. But then he's kind enough to go ahead and tell us what it is anyway. He says, it is the taking possession by the mind in clear and vivid form, one out of what seems several simultaneously possible objects or trains of thought. In other words, attention is just simply the ability to be aware of one thing instead of another thing, okay? And by one thing, aware of one thing, I literally mean one thing. That's about all you can have at one time on your, what David Rock calls your stage, okay, which you can be consciously aware of, which we'll get into in a little bit. And by instead of another thing, I mean endless other things, okay, and we'll get into that in just a little bit. That's the big challenge above all else with our attention, okay. So that's a definition. A lot of definitions sort of follow that definition, and it's pretty straightforward. It's our conscious experience. It's our subjective experience, okay? Now, how does it work in the brain? Well, that's been a source of contention. That's a little more complicated. I'll give you a whirlwind tour here, okay? Different models of attention throughout the years. Some of the early theories saw it as a filter. Like Donald Broadbent was a scientist who considered it as a filter, okay? He said that basically your brain is handling all this information that you don't know about unconsciously, okay? And he said that information sort of goes into a little holding cell, not a physical cell, of course, but you know, it's just sort of grouped together and just there available, okay? And then it goes through sort of a filter based on, well, your own psyche, you know, your own personality, how you think about things. It goes through that filter, and then bless you. Then due to that filter, you know, it filters out most of it, and you get just a little bit of it, and that's what you're able to pay attention to, and everything else gets just completely tuned out and ignored. Now, later on comes a lady named Anne Treisman, who was a famous attention researcher. And she said, well, that's almost it, but really, excuse me just a little bit. She said that's almost it, but instead of what gets filtered out just disappearing, she said it gets turned down, like the volume on a radio, okay? The attunement theory. It gets tuned down, if you will, or turned down. And then along comes her husband, who happened to be Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in economics for his work in cognitive science, okay? World famous psychologist, in addition to her. And he says, no, my dear, that's of all the things to argue with your wife about, okay, on a very public stage, I wouldn't doubt Dr. Kahneman didn't wind up on the couch for a night or two over that one. He wrote a whole book about it called Attention and Effort. Now, I don't think that's exactly how science works, okay? They have differing views, and all scientists are trying to put their views out there. Let's just learn from it. His idea was that learning is mental effort, okay? This sounds about right because we say paying attention, okay? It's like we're doing something to get attention or to apprehend things, okay? Again, back to James's definition, the taking possession of the mind. And this makes sense because the word attention comes from the Latin attendere, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing, which means literally to reach toward. Okay, so Kahneman said it's like you're reaching out with your mind and apprehending things. If you see things, vision is how we think about attention a lot because we're visual creatures. You know, like your dog is a smelling creature, we're seeing creatures, okay? Over 50% of our cortex is devoted to eyesight. And you reach out with your eyes and get it, right? He said you apprehend information, and that's what it is. Now, there are other theories too, but y'all, I've tried to come up with a good model that makes sense and sort of sums all this up, okay? And the best thing that I could come up with is a funnel, all right? Now, y'all know what a funnel is. A funnel is what you use to pour motor oil into your car so that you don't spill it all over the motor, okay? Unless you have a steadier hand than I do, or you have a newer car that you don't have to pour motor oil into all the time, okay? But you pour it into the big part, which we will call the hopper, you know, the big part, where you pour the oil into. And in this model, the hopper is going to represent everything that your brain is processing at one time, both consciously and unconsciously, okay? Just everything your brain is handling in one moment. And then you have the, you know, it funnels down to this narrow part right here. It funnels down to this narrow part right here, which we can call the chute. Okay, think about like a grain elevator or a grain. You know, you got the hopper, and then it goes down to this chute right here, and a very little bit. So that's very narrow. It's only going to hold a little bit. This holds a lot. This holds just a little bit. And the chute, if all this is everything, all these chunks of information that your brain is processing, this chute here is what you can be aware of consciously, okay? What fits into your attention. Does that make sense to everybody? It's just a visual to imagine that. And you can see it's long here. I call this the funnel of memory because this is stuff how stuff gets into your memory, okay? Memory is a little more complicated than that, but this is sort of how it begins to get in there, okay? It's long, that's what we would call sustained attention, if you're able to keep your attention on one thing at one time, or they call it vigilance. And then it's going to wind up in your memory. This is not proportional. This is the biggest point perhaps that I can make today, is that this is not proportional. If this were proportional, then this little spout right here, this chute, would be about that size, and this hopper would be the size of this building, okay? Because these bits of information, these chunks of information that our brain is handling at one time, it is in the millions of bits of information, okay? Quite literally. It's every sight, meaning every shape, size, color, texture, every sound, every sensation from your five senses, everything you see and feel out here, everything you feel in here, you feel your heart beating, you know, feel your diaphragm expanding your lungs, all that's in there. Your blood chemistry, that's being regulated, your brain is handling that, the beating of your heart, every thought bubbling in and out of your consciousness, every emotion you have, it's easily millions of bits of information. And you can only be aware of all those chunks of information. It's about 4 chunks of information, okay, out of just millions of bits. The number of bits you can be aware of at any one time, bits of information, just little bitty chunks, it's anywhere from 40 to 120 depending on whose book you read, okay? But it's a very, very little bit, and the 4 chunks of information. Attention is roughly the same thing as working memory, okay? This is work out of Princeton. It's found that the neural mechanisms of what we call working memory, that you hang on to for just a short period of time, hanging on to a phone number long enough to write it down or put it in your phone or whatever we do nowadays, put it in your phone probably. That's working memory. It has basically the same neural network in the brain as what we call attention, okay? And that's roughly 4 chunks of information. We've always heard 7 plus or minus 2, I think, of what you can hang on to your brain for just a little bit of time. It's closer to about 4 chunks of information. Okay, out of millions. So we have a very, very narrow capacity. That 4 chunks of information, that's about enough for you to carry on a conversation. Okay, if you're talking with somebody and you really have to listen, you can't do anything else that requires any thinking to speak of while you're doing it, okay? And there's a cost to this because I know Dr. Sasser in his session this morning talked about multitasking and how difficult it is, okay? We really can't do it. What we're doing instead is just shifting from one thing to another, back and forth. And every time we shift back and forth, as I have heard in endless talks and presentations, there's something called switch cost. We lose about 10 IQ points worth of brain power every time we switch over to another thing. And the studies I've read, every single talk that I've heard, the presentation I've heard that's talked about this, they for some reason compare it to smoking marijuana. They say that you lose about 10 IQ points switching from one thing to another. You lose about 5 IQ points smoking marijuana. I don't know what the obsession with this is, but the point is it's very costly to us to switch from one thing to another, okay? And so this makes it very difficult. And the question then becomes, if there's so little room in this chute right here, what determines what gets into the chute? What determines what's going to wind up in there? Because if we only have 4 chunks of information, this little bitty bit of information, it's important what gets in the chute, right? So what gets in the chute is important, and what's important is what gets into the chute, all right? It's what we attach significance to, what we decide is significant. It's as if we give weight to these chunks of information and they sort of flow down to the bottom. I know that's not how fun works, okay, but just for sake of illustration, that's kind of how it is. And that's what winds up down here, is what we consider to be significant. In terms of voluntary attention, what you decide to pay attention to is going to depend on your goals in the moment, okay? And it can also be a reaction. That's involuntary attention. There are certain things that are going to get your attention. Like if I say to you, look at my hand. Well, you can decide, look at my hand. Or you can decide, it's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. I'm going to look at his hand. Or I can say, look at my hand. You're probably going to look at the hand because loud noises is one thing that we're sort of hardwired to, that gets our attention, okay? But in terms of voluntary attention, us deciding what's going to get down here, it does seem to have to do with our goals, what we're trying to accomplish. If you've ever been in a town that you've never been to before, and you're driving down the road, and you don't know where anything is, if you're hungry, you ain't going to miss a restaurant or a billboard or a sign for a restaurant, okay? Because it's on your mind. It's a goal of yours, okay? It's all right there, but you're not going to see all of it. Have you ever bought a car that was a different color than you'd ever had before? And you're like, this is a different shade of green. Nobody's got this. And then you don't see one on the road, and then you buy it, and then what happens? Driving home, about every third or fourth car is that exact color, right? Because we don't notice it. Y'all do a little quick exercise, real quick, nice and easy one. I want you to look around this room. This will be kind of difficult because there's not a lot in this room. But I want you to look around this room. Take about 15 seconds. And I want you to see if you can identify 5 things that are the color brown. Okay? Don't say them out loud. Just look at them. Mentally list them. I'm going to test your memory in just a second. I'm going to have you recite silently to yourself 5 things that you see that are the color brown. That's the color that I see the most here. In case you need a little help, here's a brown piece of chalk. All right. So is everybody singing about 3, 4, 5 things that are the color brown? Okay. I want you to look straight ahead at me. I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to list mentally in your mind 5 things in this room that are the color red. Y'all can open your eyes. You weren't looking for red, were you? But it was right there. Do you see red stuff now? Not a whole lot, but there's some reddish stuff in there. I got to pick better colors. Y'all get the point, though, right? If we'd had a fire truck in here, we may not have seen it, okay? And y'all may have heard of the gorilla experiment. Have y'all ever seen this on YouTube? Just, okay, if nobody's seen it, I'm not going to spoil it for you, but go to YouTube and just type in gorilla experiment, okay? It's fascinating. What I'm trying to say is this. I had y'all do that already. What I'm trying to say is this. You don't see what you're looking at. You see what you're looking for, okay? You don't see what you... Otherwise, you could look at this word puzzle right here and pick out the word leaf just like that. It's up there. We're looking at it. Of course, there's a lot of noise in that signal too, I understand. But there's a lot of noise in life too, and you have to be looking for it if you're going to notice it. Has anybody found it yet?
Yeah.
Did you? Okay. For everybody else, I'll just show you so we can move along, okay? But, it's all right there. So the goal of all of this that I'm talking about, the goal of having good attention is clarity, okay? Clarity. It's important to see clearly. It's important to think clearly, but it's more important to see clearly because good thinking comes from good seeing. Seeing things as accurately as we can, okay? The neuroscientist Amishi Jha, who is from the University of Miami, talks about 3 modes of attention that have corresponding neural networks. There are 3 different sort of networks in the brain that correspond to different kinds of attention, okay? She talks about the alerting system. She says this is like a floodlight. This is when it's, or open awareness is another term they use for it sometimes. It's like when you're not really paying attention to anything in particular, you're just sort of surveying the landscape, both external or internal, to see what needs to be paid attention to in the moment. She says it's kind of like a floodlight. Like if you hear something outside at night and you go and flip on the floodlight, you're going to be able to see a good bit of the yard, but you're just not going to be able to see it very well because it's dispersed, okay? It's kind of like if you're looking also, you don't really have enough room to do this, but try this sometime. If you put your hands out in front of you like this, and then you start to spread your arms like this, just see how far you can see it in your peripheral vision, okay? And that way you're kind of looking at everything. It winds up being about 180 degrees. Dr. Jha says it's 200 degrees. She may have better peripheral vision than I do, okay? But that's the floodlight. That's the alerting system where you're just kind of on alert and seeing what needs to be paid attention to. Then you have the executive attention network. That's what she calls the juggler, okay? That is the executive sitting behind the desk making the decisions in your brain, so to speak, okay? It's the network that helps you to determine what it is that you, to juggle, to point attention where it needs to go, okay? So if you flip on that floodlight and you hear something, where you're going to, you hear where it's coming from, so that's where you're going to decide to direct your attention. And then there is the orienting system in the brain, the orienting mode of attention. And that is what we generally call attention or focus, okay? That's laser-like focus. We're really gonna focus on something, okay? So if you heard something over there in the bushes with the floodlight on, you go out there with a big high-powered flashlight and flash it on there, and you see the armadillo under there. We have armadillos in my house, so you see that armadillo. You're not going to be able to see much outside of that, but that where it is, you're going to be able to see that real good, okay? Because it's concentrated. So that's that type of attention, the flashlight. And the idea is that we use the alerting, the floodlight, if you will, to sort of survey and see what needs to be paid attention to. We use our executive network to decide what to pay attention to, and then the flashlight to home in on it and see what we need and get from it what we need to get from it. That's how we get clarity. Does that make sense to everybody? Is that clear? So how do we do that? Well, we begin by looking at what's in the chute, being aware of what is in our conscious attention. Have y'all ever said something to somebody and you were surprised that it came out of your mouth? Like, did I just say that? What? And it's the same thing sometimes with our thoughts too. We can be surprised at something that's in our brain. So it's important for us to look in there and sort of see what's in there. Now this goes by several different names that you've heard. A word that gets thrown around in education circles a lot right now is metacognition. That is aware of your cognition, aware of what you're thinking of. Meta-awareness is another word, just aware of what you're aware of, basically. Mindfulness is another word that corporate circles, that one gets thrown around a pretty good bit. Now that, of course, has sort of a spiritual connotation to it. And it's often misunderstood as trying to clear your mind. You know, I'm going to meditate and clear my mind. It's not clearing the mind so much as it is watching the mind and seeing what's in the chute. Self-awareness is a term most of us are more familiar with. And then executive attention, that juggler. Okay, that's where the action is right there in making those decisions of what we're going to pay attention to. And that's generally what we're talking about. When our students are bored with what we're talking about, we want to help them point that flashlight to where we want it to be. So how do we do that? Well, you do that the same way that a basketball player gets better at making free throws. You practice, okay? That's the only way I know of to get better at free throws is to shoot a whole bunch of them, right? And it's the same thing here. So we know what you need to do to practice to get better at free throws. Just back up 15 feet from the goal and shoot a whole bunch of them. So what does that mean in terms of getting better at attention? Well, you can do what the Navy SEALs do. Tactical breathing. Now, I love this graphic here because it looks like it was drawn on a Commodore 64 or something, okay? It's got this kind of broken up here. This has to do mostly with this muscle right here, the diaphragm. And I know y'all know what that is. It's a muscle that runs right along in here, underneath the lungs. And when you breathe in, it goes down to expand your lungs. And when you breathe out, it goes up to squinch your lungs, I guess, and get air out of them, okay? Breathing is interesting because it is an autonomic function. It's done automatically. We don't have to think about breathing. If we did, we'd probably suffocate to death sometimes, okay? But we also can control it because that is a muscle that controls it. And what the SEALs do, according to an article in Forbes here, is tactical breathing. That is, when they need to focus, just simply breathe in to the count of 4 and breathe out to the count of 4. Okay? In to the count of 4 and out to the count of 4. Breathing through the nose, if at all possible, because that breath is much, much better for you. It's hydrated, it's filtered better, and it's slower. Okay? What I talk to students about is a little bit of a variation of that, a 10-second breath, okay? Breathing into the count of 4 and then out to the count of 6. A little bit slower on the out breath, a little bit longer on the out breath, because when you breathe in, it speeds up your heart rate slightly, and then when you breathe out, it slows it down slightly. So a little bit longer on the out breath that does tend to slow the nervous system down a little bit, and I find that I have to settle myself down throughout the day, okay? So that helps a little bit, and that helps get clarity. Whatever you do, just like a basketball player trying to, if they're trying to get better at free throws, don't beat yourself up if you're not hitting 100%, okay? The goal is not to empty your mind. The goal is not to have perfect attention, okay? Because our attention does, in fact, need to be flexible. And sometimes we need to daydream and think up problems to solutions, right? The goal is not to always have perfect laser-like focus. The goal is to get better and better and better at bringing our attention back in, okay? To truly bring our attention to what we're doing. That was my dad's admonition to me growing up. I grew up on a farm. We had a lot of dangerous equipment. I had a bad attention span. And if he said it once, he said it a million times. Watch what you're doing. Watch what you're doing. I bet y'all tell your students that. Watch what you do, because you can get hurt if not, right? In anything. So that's the idea, is just to continue to get better and better. And every time you do get distracted, and you take a breath and pull it back in, every time you do get distracted, that's just another opportunity to practice, okay? And you do get better and better at it over time. Now, a famous psychiatrist, actually an addiction psychiatrist and neuroscientist at Brown University, Judson Brewer, talks about how important curiosity is to this process, to be curious about it. In other words, you're not just ordering yourself, to pay attention or to take a breath or bring it back in or anything like that. Instead, it's just being curious about it. I wonder what would happen if I were to breathe into the count of 4 right now and breathe out to the count of 6. How does it feel? Do I feel more relaxed? Does my head feel a little clearer? Okay, just out of curiosity, just to see if it works, okay? And if you are really stressed and it is really hard for you to concentrate, there is one other, what I've been talking to about so far is not a silver bullet, okay? It's a free throw. It's practice. If you need a silver bullet, this isn't one, but this is somewhat close, okay? Andrew Huberman, a neuroscientist at Stanford Medical School, talks about a physiological sigh. He says this has been in medical textbooks since the 1930s. And what this is you breathe in quickly 2 times and then breathe out like a sigh, okay? Of course, you want to close your mouth, all right? You don't want to be sitting in your office like Darth Vader, like that. So in 2 and out 1. 2 or 3 of those does seem to bring the stress level down. So that's, and help clear the mind. Again, none of this is a silver bullet. It's just a practice, okay? It's a practice. Another thing you can do, just a couple more things, and we'll be done here, y'all. Some of y'all might have heard me talk about the Pomodoro Technique before. I know I just blab on and on to people I know about this. An Italian scientist named Francesco Cirillo came up with this. It's a method of managing your time so that you're able to keep your attention in one place, okay? It's especially good for studying. That's what he talks about when he's talking about this. Pomodoro, he's an Italian fella, as y'all can probably tell. Pomodoro is the Italian word for tomato. And he used a tomato timer, like kitchen timer, like a tomato, like you can see here. He discovered that if you're really engaged in a hard cognitive task, you just can't do it forever. The limit seems to be about 25 minutes. So I tell students all the time, if you're going to take 3 hours and study, and you're just going to study straight through for 3 hours, for the first 25 minutes you're doing some good. For the last 2 hours and 35 minutes, you just kid yourself, okay? And so what this method is very simple. Set a timer. You can use a tomato or egg timer if you want to. Everybody's phone has a timer. I just say set the timer for 25 minutes, put the phone away because out of sight is out of mind, And that's very important. I make my 16-year-old put his phone in a separate room when he's doing homework, okay? And for 25 minutes, do nothing but study or concentrate or, whatever it is that you need to do, read a report, whatever you've got to learn from, okay? You can do it for 25 minutes. I mean, that's another thing that gives you a psychological advantage. Oh, I can have it for 25 minutes. And then when that timer goes off, you set it for 5 minutes, okay? So you're going in 30-minute blocks, 25 on and 5 off. And for 5 minutes, you do anything but study. It's kind of like eating. You can't just eat a meal constantly. You got to stop every now and then and let it digest. And that's kind of how this works, okay? So for 5 minutes, moving around, walking, I just pace around the room a lot, okay? I have a lot of nervous energy. I can't get still. So that helps. But for 5 minutes, don't do it. And then when that timer goes off, back to 25 minutes and back to it over and over again. I have gotten significant results from this myself, as has my 16-year-old who used to not be able to finish homework. It would take all night, all right? He got his old man's attention span, okay? And then, this may seem silly, but games, there are a lot of apps out there, games that are supposed to help you with your attention. I like good old word puzzles and solitaire, okay? That's using tech to cut up the carrots, okay? That's good for you. Not only do games like this keep your attention, if you're interested in those sort of games, but also it helps you to notice patterns, which is another important thing for attention, to notice how things fit together. And so that can be helpful. But the final thing I will tell you is, as far as students go, I think probably the best thing that we can do to foster good attention in them is just simply to give them our attention. And I know this is something y'all are doing already. It's just something we need to keep doing, okay? I'm very fortunate in the job I have in adult ed. I'm roughly a student advisor, a career coach, and I work with students in all 5 counties that we serve. And I'm fortunate to get to know a lot of them, to really sit down and some of them have fascinating stories. I put this out on Facebook sometimes, just you wouldn't believe what some of these folks have been through. And I get to listen and hear these stories. And this is what Stephen Covey talked about when he talked about listening to understand rather than to just respond. He said most people listen just thinking about what they're going to say back, okay? He talks about listening, and President Ford talked about this earlier too. Listening to understand, to really hear. Covey said that for a person to feel understood, he said it's like a balm for the soul. It soothes people. And so I have to think that helping our students to be soothed has got to help with their attention. Okay? That's all I've got. Yeah.